Hello everybody and welcome back to some more Kerbal Space Program. Now, over the years there have been a variety of challenges presented to the KSP community from a variety of sources. So today we're going to take a look at a handful of examples of the really classic challenges, talk a little bit about how KSP has changed in the intervening years, and talk about some of the problems and principles that lie within those challenges, which I'm sure many of you will be aware of, but some of you might not be. So there's going to be an element of a tutorial for newer players. I'm just trying something new. Please let me know what you think in the comments. So we're going to start with what I think is probably my favourite of the three challenges we're going to be looking at today, and that is the Runway Speed challenge. The idea was a simple one. You get some kind of ground vehicle pointing straight down the runway and see how fast you can get it to go while still being able to stop before you run out of runway. Now, I don't think this is the actual vehicle I produced at the time. I think this is a slightly updated version I did a year or two later, but it was still a few years ago now, and I think we can see almost immediately that something's not quite right. So before Jebediah gets too queasy in there, I think we should go and see if we can fix that quickly. Okay, so we've managed to stop the bouncing, which is nice. Just to take a quick look at the vehicle itself, I think you can pretty much see what it's all about. We've got three of these afterburning jet engines, a bunch of Separatrons on the side, each side for a quick boost of acceleration when we need it, fins for helping with stability, and some drogue and normal chutes top and bottom towards the back for when we're getting to the end of our run. So, well, let's see how this has stood the test of time, shall we? So what I want to do is, that should be engine mode, that's throttle, so we want to, there we go, brakes do nothing, so let's go for a burst of speed now. Oh, we may need to update this design a little. So here we are then, an updated version for 2019. Now, you might notice I've ditched the audio intake in favour of an integrated one, just primarily because it looks better. But the main change has been the wheels, and this kind of speaks to one of the changes that's been ongoing with KSP as it's evolved into a better and better simulator. So the consequences of either under or over engineering the things have become more pronounced. Like on this vehicle, I couldn't get away with using those puny wheels anymore. It's got to be something a bit more substantial. But anyway, let's see if we can get this vehicle into proper action for once. So it's pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory. I start off the afterburning engines, kick in the Separatrons. Once those have burnt out, I kill the throttle, deploy the drogue chutes, apply the brakes, and then deploy the main chutes in that order. And hopefully we should stop and have a pretty good time. So let's see. We'll just start the engines, turn them onto afterburning mode, get a little bit of thrust going, and then it's brakes, throttle, Separatrons. And we stop well short of the end of the runway, and we managed a maximum speed of 267. Well, not bad, but given the amount of runway we've got left, I think it can certainly be improved upon. And improve upon it is exactly what we do. I made a whole bunch of runs here. I'm not going to go through them individually because that would take forever. I'm just going to sort of recap the highlights quickly. We're using the same procedure I used on that first run, just throttle up, brakes off, hit the Separatrons immediately, and then go through the slowdown procedure I mentioned. The first run out we managed to get 280 meters per second, which is something of improvement, but still a little bit of runway left to go, so I try and go a bit faster. Next run we get up to 317 meters per second, and I careen off the end of the runway, so that doesn't count. And that's pretty much the pattern. I do get up to 302, but anything past that and we don't manage to stop before the end of the runway is upon us. In this last run, I decide I'm going to tweak the slowdown procedure, and that seems to work. I get us up to about 319 meters per second, and we stop with barely any of the runway left to spare. So I think that's as good as it's going to get. Or is it? Have I been going about this in the wrong way? Let me explain. So here we go. I've done graphs and everything for this, so buckle in. Now what I want to be doing with this vehicle is accelerating to the highest speed possible. At any one point in time, I can be doing that in one of two ways. I can either be accelerating just using the main engines, or using the main engines and the Separatrons. I could just ignore the Separatrons, or I could burn with just the Separatrons and not the main engines, but I think it's pretty obvious that's kind of suboptimal. What I've been doing up to now is to use the period of faster acceleration first. One of the reasons for this is because you can't throttle down Separatrons, let alone turn them off. They're solid rocket motors, they're going to burn until they're finished. What you don't want to be doing is trying to slow down with them still burning. So we get them out of the way to start with. It just means I can sort of judge when I want to start my slowdown procedure. It gives me a bit more flexibility. So faster acceleration followed by slower acceleration, as is roughly illustrated by this velocity time graph I've got on the left here. At the other extreme, I could hold off on burning the Separatrons until the latest feasible moment. So do the slower acceleration first, followed by the faster acceleration, as illustrated by the graph on the right here. Identical periods of faster and slower acceleration, but in the other order. The downside for that is, of course, I'd have to judge it really carefully. Apart from the factors I've already mentioned, there doesn't really appear to be that much difference between the two of them. They both reach the same velocity after the same time, so how do we decide which strategy to take? Now, if you're paying attention in maths, or like me, you were kind of paying attention in maths, but didn't really get it and had to go back later and work out what it was all about, then you'll know that the area under a velocity time graph is equal to the distance travelled. So if we look at the two graphs, we can see that whilst they both accelerate you to the same velocity after the same time, the slower then faster approach takes less distance to do so. This means there are speeds we can attain using the right-hand approach that would see us fly off the end of the runway using the left-hand approach. Is that all clear? No? Well, never mind, let's go and put it into action anyway. Okay then, let's give this a go. I think what I'm going to do is let the vehicle speed up to about 100 meters per second, and then burn the Separatrons, and then the moment they burn out, we'll start the braking sequence. So, yep, stability assist braking, engines, afterburners, just throttle up a little bit just to give us a bit of lead in, and then when we're ready, throttle all the way up, brakes off, and about now. And hopefully, oh, this is going to be close. Oh, that really is close. Anyway, what's the final score? 334 meters per second. Okay, I think that worked quite well. Anyway, I think we've seen enough of the Runway Speed Challenge. Let's see what else we've got. So the next challenge we're going to take a look at is the Weakest Thruster to Orbit challenge. The idea, again, is a very simple one. You have a rocket equipped with the weakest thruster available, and you have to use that and only that to get your vehicle into low Kerbal orbit. Now, this one is a very old challenge. I've found examples of people trying this challenge as early as 2012, which is only a year after the game entered early access. A very, very early version of KSP indeed. Scott Manley, by the way, does a brilliant video on this particular challenge. I'll put a link to that in the description. But in that video, he uses the linear RCS port to provide thrust for his vehicle. And, well, the upshot of that one is, unless you basically have a supercomputer to run the game, or you do something a little bit hacky, it's not possible to get a rocket to orbit using that particular thruster. I mean, that's not even technically the weakest thruster you can use. The weakest one would actually be the ordinary RCS block, but that's got about half the thrust of the linear port, and it's nearly twice as heavy, so that's not going to be any good either. So what I've done is I've thought, well, let's see if we can just do a standard launch pad launch and see what's the next weakest thruster we can use, and see if we can use that to get us to orbit. So here we have just a test rocket. This isn't actually going to take us to orbit, as you can probably tell, but on the bottom here I've fitted 4 of these Werner engines. Now these are technically RCS thrusters, but they use liquid fuel oxidizer mix instead of monopropellant, and I'm going to see if I can make a rocket equipped with those get to orbit. Let's just try out this little test vehicle first. So as you can see, 4 of those, more than enough to lift it off the launch pad and get us up to quite a speed actually. How's the fuel looking? Not too bad. Yeah, we're going to get to maybe a little over 4,000. No. Okay, so that's going to be a little over 3.5 kilometers peak altitude. So now I suppose it's time for us to go and build a rocket out of these things and see if we can get it to orbit. But before we do that, I just want to take a quick look at something that could pose a serious problem during this challenge. Now here we have the same vehicle, but I've just attached a more traditional fuel oxidizer engine to the bottom, and I'm going to try and take that off and hover it for reasons that will become apparent soon. Now if you're going to try and build a vehicle like this, I think it pretty quickly becomes obvious that you're going to use a lot of these thrusters, be they the Werner engines or the linear RCS ports, or if you're feeling really brave, as I've said, the standard RCS blocks. Now this presents its own problems. Now the way Kerbal Space Program treats these small innocuous parts has changed quite a lot over the last few years, up until not that long ago actually. These small parts were treated as physicsless, that is, whilst they might have had some nominal weight in the craft editor, the game engine actually wouldn't have registered them for purposes of mass or inertia or I think even drag. But of course that has now changed, and if you're going to whack a whole shed load of them onto the spacecraft, then of course that's going to add quite a lot of weight as well. And that's before we get into the hassle of just sticking so many of the damn things onto the craft in the first place. So you might be tempted to go for a low thrust approach, a thrust to weight ratio that's not much above 1, but for reasons, sort of as I mentioned earlier, that most of you will be aware of, but just for those who aren't, this would be a mistake, and this all comes back to the little rocket I'm trying to hover right here. Now, while we might be getting a little bit of side drift in this rocket, in the important direction for a rocket, that is sort of up and down, we're not actually going anywhere, and yet we're still having to expend fuel to do so. Or in other words, we're going nowhere and paying for the privilege. And any rocket, before it gets into orbit, will always be having to pay some kind of overhead just to fight against gravity, particularly before it starts any form of gravity turn. And the longer it takes to get to orbit, the higher that overhead is going to become. We call these overheads gravity losses, and when you combine that with the fact that the kind of thrusters we're talking about, linear RCS ports, Werner thrusters, have a very significant fuel efficiency drop-off in the lower atmosphere, then it becomes very apparent that it really doesn't pay to hang around. Now, there are reasons why you don't want them to go too fast either, but we'll come on to those a little later. In the meantime, I think it's time we get back to building our rocket. So I started with what is essentially just a larger version of my original test rocket, still with just the 4 Werner thrusters on it, and I kind of envisage this being the upper stage of whatever vehicle we finally end up with, but I did want to test it just on its own to see how it performs, and it does quite well, gets up to 15,000 meters, so now it's just a case of strapping a larger stage onto the bottom of it and seeing if we can get into orbit. This was my first attempt at a 2-stage vehicle that I hoped would get to orbit. That first stage has 16 Werner thrusters on the bottom of it, and it does quite well, all things considered. Those things being the fact that it's very difficult to get an optimal ascent profile using these engines. But nonetheless, we do actually get into space, but we end up falling about 400 meters per second short of actual orbital velocity. So back to the drawing board it is. For the next incarnation of this vehicle, I just expanded the 2 stages just to see if that will give us the extra delta V we need to finally push on into orbit. This is actually the second of the 2 attempts I made with this version of the vehicle. The first one wasn't that much better than the previous one, but by this attempt I was starting to get to grips with how to sort of fly this thing, how to push it on into orbit, and for this attempt we fall agonizingly short. I mean, our periapsis is up to about 62 kilometers. We'd have needed, less than 50 meters per second delta V extra, and we'd have been there. So this presented something of a poser. Do I try again, see if I can find some more optimizations that would see us get into orbit, or do I just say sod it, whack another stage on the bottom and have done with it? Well, no prizes for guessing A. Yes, I've taken the coward's way out and just strapped another stage onto the bottom of it. This one has 24 Werner thrusters on the bottom there, but that's not enough to get this off the ground. We need to fire up those 16 thrusters on the second stage, making it 40 in total, lifting this thing skywards. And, well, you won't be very surprised to learn that, yes, this does actually make it into orbit, and with quite a fair bit of delta V left to spare. It's quite interesting just looking back at that Scott Manley video, just the computer melting difficulty of doing this with the linear RCS ports, and the relative ease with which I managed to do this using the next worst engine. At least I hope it's the next worst engine. I mean, if I missed one, then I'm going to hear about it in the comments. But anyway, that's that challenge finished. Let's go and look at our final challenge of today. So our final challenge of today is the shortest possible space mission challenge. The idea is, well, it's pretty self-explanatory. You have to get a Kerbal from the launch pad into space, then back down onto terra firma safely as quickly as you possibly can. Now, this is different from your normal KSP rocket launch, in that once you get to space, you're not really interested in staying there, so you don't have to worry about getting to orbit. In fact, it's better if you don't, because the shortest distance between you and space is, of course, straight up, so that's what we'll be doing. I built myself a very simple prototype here. We're going to just use this as a benchmark, and well, this challenge throws up a few points of interest, but we'll discuss those as we see how this vehicle gets on. So here we go with our benchmark mission. Now, one thing we don't have to worry about quite as much with this mission as we would do with a normal launch to orbit is what's called atmospheric losses, or friction losses, or drag losses, or whatever you want to call them. But once again, for those of you new to the whole rocket science thing, atmospheric losses are, well, I think you've probably guessed, they're losses due to atmospheric drag. They're kind of the flip side of the coin to gravity losses, whereas gravity losses punish you for going too slowly, atmospheric losses punish you for going too fast, and it's not a linear relationship either. In aerodynamics, your drag is proportional to your velocity squared, not just your velocity. So if you're travelling twice as fast, you'll have 4 times as much drag, 4 times as much fuel being used just to keep you going as fast as you're going. Now, the upshot of all this is that at any one point in time, there'll be some optimum speed, some optimum trade-off between gravity losses and atmospheric losses. And obviously, as you get higher and the atmosphere gets thinner and atmospheric effects diminish, that speed is going to get faster and faster and faster. It's also basically the reason that spacecraft start travelling straight up and then pitch over later. It's just to get out of that thicker, lower atmosphere so they can start picking up that orbital speed higher up where the atmospheric losses are going to be much, much lower. Anyway, I think that's enough of that for today. As I said, it doesn't really affect this challenge too much because of the small vehicle and the fact we're just heading straight up and out of the atmosphere as quickly as possible. On that note, we actually put the initial apoapsis quite high above that 70-kilometre boundary mark, just to get us into space as quickly as possible, and then as we're approaching the edge of the atmosphere, we flip the rocket around and start to fire back down towards Kerbal, just to cut that short and start our journey home. In the atmosphere, I leave the service module attached just because the vehicle as a whole has a higher weight-to-drag ratio than just the command module, so that's like an anchor pulling us down into the atmosphere faster. I leave it as late as I dare to detach the command module, and do likewise with firing the parachute, and we land pretty spot on the 5-minute mark, which isn't bad, but I think it can be improved. So this is the first step in the evolution of our vehicle. I've added an extra stage to it and put some solid rocket motors on the outside, and this performs quite well. The role of the first stage and those solid rocket motors is solely to get our apoapsis up as high as possible, and then once that's done and we've detached those, we use the second stage to turn us around at the zenith of our trajectory, and also to decelerate us as the ground is approaching, and all in all, it's not a bad improvement. We land with 3 minutes and 42 seconds on the clock, but I still think there's room for improvement, and I think there's room to be a little bolder in our design choices. And in this case, bolder means getting rid of those 2 puny little solid rocket motors and replacing them with 6 of something a bit meatier. The solid rocket motors take over the sole responsibility of pushing our apoapsis up as high as possible, whilst the same 2 stages we had last time are responsible for the rest of the manoeuvres. Now, for this challenge, ideally you want to be accelerating upwards until the last possible moment, whereby you turn around and immediately start decelerating before accelerating downwards, and you should be doing that right up to the point where you flip the craft round and decelerate perfectly so that you just touch the ground as your speed reaches 0, and we're not far off of doing that. Well, certainly the closest we've come during this challenge, and we land with 3 minutes 14 seconds on the clock. Now this challenge is quite open-ended, pretty much like the Runway Speed challenge, and I could just carry on for days shaving ever-decreasing amounts off the mission time. But I think that's a pretty good time, and I think we've packed quite enough into one video as it is, so we'll leave it there for today. I do hope you've enjoyed it, everybody. Next Saturday we'll be back to more BD Armory stuff, and of course there'll be some RimWorld during the week, but in the meantime, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.